After the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, Germany was not only left in ruins but also littered with a generation of children who bore a burden unlike any other. They were the sons and daughters of Hitler's most loyal officers, ministers, propagandists, and generals. The Nazi elite whose names became synonymous with war crimes, mass killings, and dictatorship. These children grew up in a post-war landscape where their very surnames were curses, their family histories carried like a brand on their foreheads, and their futures were tangled with guilt, denial, and attempts at redemption. What unfolded in their lives reveals a haunting, often contradictory story of trauma and survival, of disowning their own blood, of confronting legacies of genocide, and of struggling to live as individuals when the world only saw them as shadows of monsters. Some children were too young to even comprehend the crimes their fathers had committed when the Allies marched through Berlin. Others were already teenagers who had been raised within the strict ideological world of Nazism, reciting slogans, saluting their fathers, and believing in the inevitability of German victory. Overnight, that world collapsed. Their fathers were either dead by suicide, executed at Nuremberg, or locked away in prison cells. Mothers were left to fend for survival, often stigmatized and shunned. The children themselves became outcasts, objects of suspicion and scorn in their own communities, with classmates mocking them or neighbors refusing to speak their names. Unlike the average German child who could blend into anonymity, these children inherited names that carried echoes of death camps and burning cities. The son of Hans Frank, the Nazi governor of occupied Poland, provides one of the most extreme examples. Hans Frank, later hanged at Nuremberg, was called the Butcher of Poland, responsible for mass killings and the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. His son Nicholas Frank grew up in post-war Germany, despising his father. Unlike many other children of the Nazi elite, Nicholas rejected denial or silence. He confronted the crimes head-on, becoming one of the most outspoken critics of his father's legacy. He wrote scathing books in which he referred to his father as a murderer and parasite, vowing that he would never forgive. His life became a mission of exposing the horrors his family embodied, a cathartic act of rebellion against the weight of his surname. Yet Nicholas's journey also highlights the strange paradox. In condemning his father so publicly, he spent his life orbiting around the very figure he loathed, unable to fully escape. Other children could not reconcile so cleanly. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and architect of the final solution, remained devoted to her father until her death in 2018. Even as the evidence of gas chambers and mass shootings filled history books, Gudrun refused to disavow him. As a child, she had adored her father, joining him on trips to Dachau concentration camp, where he presented it to her like a field inspection rather than a factory of suffering. After the war, she became a quiet but persistent defender of former SS men, helping them escape prosecution, arranging financial aid, and participating in far-right networks. Her life demonstrates the opposite path from Nicholas Frank. Instead of rejecting the legacy, she embraced it, becoming a symbol of how loyalty and indoctrination could persist across decades. Some children simply tried to disappear. Martin Bormann Jr., the son of Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann, grew up burdened by a name tied directly to the inner circle of the Führer. After the war, he became a Catholic priest, dedicating his life to religion and charity. Though he admitted to struggling with his father's monstrous role in history, he sought meaning in faith rather than denial or defense. His choice to enter the priesthood was more than personal. It was symbolic of a desire to replace his father's legacy of death with something of service and moral redemption. And yet, wherever he went, the name Bormann trailed him, drawing fascination, suspicion, and pity. His sermons were heard not only as religious guidance, but as echoes of atonement from a generation burdened by sins not their own. For children like Etta Goering, the only daughter of Hermann Göring, the trajectory was different. Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, was flamboyant, corrupt, and obsessed with power and luxury. When he was sentenced to death at Nuremberg, he cheated the hangman by committing suicide with a hidden cyanide capsule. His daughter was still a child, and for the rest of her life she clung to a glamorous yet distorted memory of her father. Etta never fully condemned him. Instead, she defended his reputation, portraying him as a brilliant military leader who was unfairly vilified by history. Even into the 21st century, she spoke fondly of him, refusing to accept the full weight of his crimes. In her case, love for her father clouded judgment, illustrating how family bonds can complicate moral clarity. The children of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, never had a chance to struggle with legacy. They were murdered by their own parents in the Führerbunker in 1945. Magda Goebbels poisoned her 6 children rather than allow them to grow up in a world without National Socialism. This act underscores a horrifying truth. Some parents in the Nazi elite viewed their children not as individuals with futures, but as extensions of ideology bound to die alongside the dream of the Reich. Those who survived, however, carried the trauma of such choices for life. The post-war world also shaped how these children were perceived. The Allies, through the Nuremberg trials and denazification programs, aimed to dismantle the Nazi machine, not only structurally, but also psychologically. Yet how do you denazify a child? Teachers, neighbors, and even relatives often struggled with the question. Some children grew up under false names, hidden from the stigma. Others were placed in foster homes, where their family connections were deliberately obscured. The Cold War added further complications. In East Germany, Nazi children were often pushed into silence, while in West Germany, the student movements of the 1960s began demanding accountability, sometimes confronting these children in public forums. The generational conflict became intense, with young Germans asking their parents, "What did you do during the war?" A question that landed with devastating weight on those whose parents were infamous. Psychologists who studied the descendants of the Nazi elite found patterns of trauma, guilt, denial, and projection. Some children inherited a crushing sense of responsibility for crimes they never committed, leading to depression and self-destructive tendencies. Others turned to radical politics, either aligning with the far right out of loyalty or with the far left out of rejection. A few became artists, writers, or filmmakers, using creative expression to grapple with the shadows of their childhood. The process of living as the child of a mass murderer meant constantly negotiating between personal identity and inherited history. What makes their stories so haunting is the way fate twisted them in opposite directions. Some became fierce defenders of democracy and human rights, determined to prevent history from repeating itself. Others clung to nostalgia for the Reich, feeding extremist movements that still haunt Germany and Europe today. Still others tried to vanish, changing their names, moving abroad, or sinking into anonymity, only to find that history has a way of following them. The twisted fates of these children remind us of how history bleeds across generations. The crimes of their fathers were not theirs to commit, but the consequences were theirs to live. They carried names that opened wounds wherever spoken, yet they also carried the opportunity to confront, to condemn, or to deny. Some became cautionary tales of loyalty to evil. Others became examples of how even the darkest legacy can be rejected. The war ended in 1945, but for these children, the struggle never truly ended. It was written into their bloodlines, shaping every relationship, every career, every moment of self-understanding. In the end, the story of the children of the Nazi elite is not one of simple inheritance, but of fractured destiny. Each of them stood at a crossroads between denial and confrontation, between shadow and selfhood. And though their paths diverged, together they show how the echo of dictatorship does not vanish when its leaders fall. It lingers in families, in societies, in the very question of what it means to outlive atrocity. The twisted fates of these children are a reminder that history is never just in the past. It is carried forward, reshaped, resisted, and sometimes repeated in the most unexpected ways through the lives of those who never asked to be born into infamy.